Germs, welcome back. My apologies for the technical difficulties that we have had regarding our primary source quiz. I will get that rectified and will quadruple check before we arrive at the end of the week with this week's primary source assignment. So I'm going to make a slight alteration to what the syllabus says. The syllabus explains that we're going to start dealing with industrial America, but I'm going to take a pause in order to start talking about the American West and what is going on with the United States as we attempt to settle the American West. And so, at the end of our lecture on Reconstruction and when Reconstruction ended, we began to discuss the disputed presidential election of 1876 and why we do know that this is the presidential election that did officially end Reconstruction. There are a couple of things that still need to be sorted out. Now, 1876, let's think about that for a moment. Why is that year important? Well, it's the centennial of American independence. And so it's an important year to celebrate. And so if we take, for example, what Professor David Blight said, and he gives this lecture when he's teaching the Civil War class. He quotes the New York Evening Post, and he says, and the quotation says, "Great work of the century is finished, and the year which is about to dawn will be the very first one wholly free from the duty of dealing with the old and dangerous subject. Slavery died in this country 10 years ago, but not until now have we finished the work of readjusting our national life to the new order of things. Not until now have the questions which grew out of slavery been fully and finally settled. Not until now have the echoes of the war died out of our politics as well as our lives. And it was finally over." Or the Springfield Republican wrote, quote, "We must get rid of the stubborn question. There is no chance or hope of healthy politics until we get rid of it. So long as the war issues are capable of being warmed over from year to year and election to election, so long as a large section of the country is disturbed by violence and paralyzed by misgovernment, so long as white is arrayed against black, so long will our politics be feverish with this disease." Or we can take it from the New York Times. The New York Times writes, 10 years ago, the North was nearly united in a feeling of sympathy for the freedmen and in a determination to defend their rights. Now, not a few believe that the rights of the whites are those which have been infringed upon. So it's the year of our centennial, 100 years as a nation. And we have three very different newspapers that are offering very different interpretations of the status of the United States. So, historical memory, narrative, right? These big looming questions that I've suggested. Why start and stop and why start and stop U.S. history at what different points? Why is this important, right? It's this struggle, this teasing out, trying to understand who's going to narrate our history, who's going to own it, control it. And it seemed in 1876 that everyone was trying to. Now, Professor Blight also goes on to discuss the centennial, the celebration of our nation, 100 years. And it was this exposition, and a massive exposition that was put on in Philadelphia, right? The Centennial Exposition, Philadelphia in 1876. And so this exposition would run from spring through the fall, would be attended by 10 million people. Now, at that time, that's about a quarter of the entire US population. So imagine an event today that would be attended. And I do mean physically, right? This isn't through pay-per-view or Zoom meetings or Skype. Physically attending an exposition, an event by a quarter of the United States. Now, this was quite a production. We had a replica of Cleopatra, which how we can relate that to our history is really uh, mind boggling. It was, of course, heading towards the machine age, right? There were technological innovations, and it was exciting. We had a telephone, we had a typewriter, we had this really exciting flooring that was called linoleum. And, Professor Blight, he starts unpacking all of this. And we had, of course, the internal combustion engine, Corliss steam engine, which was gigantic, located in the Smithsonian, and if you want to go see it, 700 tons, 40 feet high. And people looked at this and they looked up at awe, and they said that American society was going to be remade, that the United States was going to become the greatest manufacturing and industrial producing nation on the earth. True. But this is a little bit of self-congratulation, and it's going to, of course, mask or ignore some of the less admirable features of American life, and of course it would. We wouldn't want to have a celebration of 100 years as a nation and talk about the bad things or mistakes that we had made, right? And so every state would have an exhibition, right? There would of course be no mention of labor strikes that were sweeping through through Pennsylvania and through Massachusetts. There was not going to be any mention of the economic depression that we were suffering through as a nation, because we were suffering pretty significantly, and that was still going on into 1876. You know, there ended up being a women's pavilion, mostly added as an afterthought, which didn't include any information or examples of how women suffragists were protesting the fact that they didn't have the right to vote. And just for the record, women did not receive the right to vote until 1920. So this is still years ahead of that. And so what about African Americans? Well, there's zero exhibitions or exhibits about them at all. They were even barred from working on the construction crews that built the great halls that housed these exhibitions. There was a southern restaurant and had African Americans performing songs. There was some cotton that African Americans had picked from certain farms, and none of it attempted to make any sense of the recent issues that were had with Reconstruction, or the violent overthrow of governments, or anything ultimately that could portray things in a negative light. And then, of course, American Indians. Well, American Indians will be represented as or depicted as a people of the past, perhaps a vanishing Indian, or a type of cultural mystique, of course, deeply American mystique. And so when we think about the West, right, what images come to mind? Just take a second and pause and stop and think about what images come to mind when you think about the American West, and what you've learned, and how you think of it and remember it. Might think of John Wayne, or Indians and teepees and cowboys and 6 shooters, or perhaps the gold rush, right? But the way that we've come to learn about the West are kind of shortchanges the real history of the West. So let's begin to unpack this. Now, this is going to be a brief survey of the American West from 1865 to roughly 1890. And what ends up happening is in 1890, our Census Bureau basically announced that the Western frontier was closed, that we had finally completed, that we had finally settled the West. Now, there's a gentleman named Frederick Jackson Turner, and what he does is he writes something that is known as the Frontier Thesis. Now, Frontier Thesis is a really interesting interpretation of the Western frontier and its impact on our history. And what Turner does is he argues that our history, that American history, is distinctive from other countries because of the existence of the frontier. That it is the process of civilizing these new frontiers that gave Americans their very distinctive traits, which include individualism, include inventiveness, individualistic democracy, right? The ability to start over, this notion that you could come and that you could pull yourself up by the bootstraps and make something of yourself and make a name for yourself, and that you had to take your destiny into your own hand, right? And so Turner's thesis in today's world is pretty hotly debated. During this time period, it was widely embraced. Now, Turner's frontier thesis isn't incredibly long, but it was widely embraced, so much so that it earned him a position at Harvard, which would be fantastic. Now, I digress, but his thesis left Americans a little bit uncomfortable with the idea that our frontier was closed. Right? So if the frontier is something that makes us unique from other countries, if it is so essential to the character of America, to the United States, then what's going to happen if there is no frontier left? You know, when we think about this thesis, is the frontier what Turner believed it to be? Is the frontier free land that is ripe for the taking from for enterprising white Americans? Is there no one living in the West at this time? No, of course not. We have in the Southwest we have Latinos, in the actual West we have Native Americans, and so it's not really this open land that is uninhabited, but of course, well, we'll come back to that. We'll unpack that here in a little bit. Now, federal government was aware of this drive, this push to settle the frontier, and so they enact a couple of different things, we pass a couple of different laws that are going to encourage this settlement of the West, right? We want to encourage people to move west and to live there. And so the Homestead Act of 1862 is one such example. So this act allows any American that did not fight for the Confederacy to claim 160 acres of federal land. Now, the way that this worked is in order to own the land, you had to live on it for 5 years. In addition to living on that land for 5 years, you had to, quote, improve it, right? Which might mean that you cleared some trees, that you began an irrigation project, that you built a house and you started taking care of it and farming. And so it's kind of open to interpretation. But at the end of that 5 years, you would pay a small registration fee, and then the land would be yours. Or you could live on it for 6 months and then purchase it for $1.25 an acre, which is still pretty cheap at that time. Now, this Homestead Act didn't quite draw the number of people west as the government believed. Urban families, for example, they're going to have very little capital. They're going to not know how to farm, right? Not be familiar with the wilderness, but even so, it would end up encouraging westward expansion, and people would take advantage of the offer, right? We would have individuals and families, surveyors, small farmers, and I don't mean like small farmers, but small scale farmers, and as well freed slaves that would move west. But even then, at this time, let's think about what travel was like. How would you travel west? This isn't as simple as booking a plane ticket or getting a bus or driving your car, right? It's complicated, and travel was complicated. And one solution to this became railroads, right? We began increasing railroad construction pretty significantly in the 1870s. Now, I'm going to give you guys a couple statistics. Excuse me, numbers. So in 1871, we have about 45,000 miles of track that had been laid. Between 1871 and 1900, that number would jump to 170,000 additional miles of track that were added. Transcontinental Railroad, what is it? It's a railroad that will connect the east to the west. It's going to go across our nation, right? And most of these railroads and railroad companies would be given land grants by the federal government in order to build them, right? They didn't have to pay for the land. So why do we think that the federal government would be so invested in the railroad? Well, we'll scratch that and backtrack a second. Okay. Investing in the railroad is going to increase westward expansion as well as development. It's going to make travel safer, easier, and it's going to encourage more settlers to move to the west, right? And this is also going to influence economic growth, right? It's going to provide the west with access to the markets in the east. Now we could say, if you're in the Midwest, ship cattle or ship crops to market. We can ship them back east. And this is also going to allow people that lived in the West, more on the frontier, the opportunity to purchase ready-made items like clothing. And so ultimately it's going to make the world just a little bit smaller, right? And so when we think about this transcontinental railroad, it encouraged expansion, but what it also is going to do is it's going to make an already diverse area more diverse. Right? The American West is unique for the amount of diversity among its inhabitants. Land and economic opportunity are only going to encourage more and more people to come. So, for example, African Americans, they're going to move to the West. They want to escape the violence that is in the South after the Civil War, right? They're going to try to escape those living conditions, and so they're going to take advantage of the opportunity to own their own land, right? And you're going to see the creation of various all-black communities that are going to spring up in the West. Now, Hispanics of various origins had resided in the West before white settlers, of course. And once California and the other territories that were previously owned by Mexico and before that Spain, before we brought those into the United States, white settlers already began to oust Hispanics, and the more white settlers that entered into the West, Hispanics are going to lose their land and often their wealth, and they will begin to face pretty severe discrimination and pretty extensive poverty. Mormons also move west, right? They're looking to avoid religious persecution. Many people did not like them for their polygamist beliefs. And so, who else? Well, we start to see Chinese laborers, right? Which Chinese laborers are going to emerge as the most persecuted group that moves into the West. And we have Chinese immigrants and other Asians, but particularly the Chinese. Well, why do they come to the West? Think about that for a second. Why do these immigrants come to the West? What is there that would be drawing them? Well, they came for the gold rush in the 1850s. But what ends up happening is we have whites that begin to rally and to get legislation passed that attempted to keep the Chinese from mines, right? But they, of course, still immigrated. They worked the jobs that they could get. Railroads hired Chinese labor. They were cheap. They worked hard. I'll give you an example. So, for the Central Pacific Line alone, You have 12,000 Chinese that were employed, which represents about 90% of the workforce, right? And the Central Pacific would be the first transcontinental railroad that was finished. So by 1870, we have around 63,000 Chinese that live in the United States and are denied access to citizenship. Now, this is built largely upon racist beliefs, right? These beliefs of white purity, that they are in fact a threat to American labor. But okay, give me a rough estimate of what you think, what percentage they make up of our population, right? We got 63,000. 0.002% of our population. Now, in 1882, what we do is we pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. What this does is it suspends Chinese immigration for a period of 10 years, and it denies them access to citizenship. In 1892, for 10 more years, we renewed this act, and then in 1902, Chinese immigration was made permanently illegal. So what this does is it encourages legislation that's going to target other groups, which includes Middle Easterners, East Indians, and the Japanese. Excuse me. So what year do you think that the Chinese were actually able to get citizenship? It wasn't until 1943. Now, this type of legislation is pretty effective. They became a targeted group, and their population would begin to drop. Most of the Chinese immigrants that would arrive in the United States were, in fact, male. Um, and so it's hard to sustain a population without immigration and without females to help sustain it, right? And then who else is in the West at this time? Native Americans, right?